Well, to counter those voices of protest, Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall and several U.S. governors, most of them Republican, sent a letter to Obama last month urging approval of the Keystone XL Pipeline now that its route through Nebraska has been altered to avoid an aquifer. He joins us now from his riding office in Swift Current. Mr. Wall, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
So is Canada losing the PR war on the oil sands?
Well, I think there have been some challenges for some time. We don't have any commercial scale oil sands in the province. We have the potential one day to have oil sands development, but we're strictly a conventional producer of oil. And our concern is, the term dirty Canadian oil, which is used by some environmental groups in the U.S., that paints both conventional and oil sands Canadian energy. It's just frankly not good for the trade relationship. And here lately, we've been very concerned by at least the notional linkage between Keystone approval and some sort of change in Canadian domestic policy that would be preferred by the U.S. administration. So we're also seeking some clarification from the U.S. ambassador to our country on just what was meant by this discussion recently, where although it was expressly said not to be a linkage, there seemed to be a de facto link between Keystone approval and Canada changing its domestic policies.
Well, but we also had the U.S. president this week endorse the idea of a carbon tax or maybe a cap and trade regime. So isn't it time we at least had another discussion about that in Canada? Or the fact that new environmental regulations on the oil industry, which have been promised for years now, still aren't here?
Kevin, we've been doing more than having a discussion about it. Alberta was the first jurisdiction in Canada, and I think perhaps one of the first ones in North America to actually price carbon. You can't have any of this discussion about mitigating CO2, or cap and trade or carbon tax without first deciding on a price for carbon. Now BC has a tax. We have our greenhouse gas emissions legislation. We will develop our own fund and a levy for those who are emitting beyond limits. I think it's up to us to get the message out that, frankly, it's not Canada that needs to catch up to the United States in this regard. It's the other way around. And again, I think we should be concerned about sort of the notion of linkages here. We don't see the same kind of linkage in the United States in terms of their other sources of oil. They're exporting oil from countries like Saudi Arabia that don't grant full rights to women. They're importing oil from Nigeria, the carbon footprint of which is very high when you account for the tanker traffic. There doesn't seem to be any protests about that. And so I do think we in Canada have to do a better job of getting our message out and being engaged on this file. We have a record on the environment here. It needs to be better. We're working on that. But we also haven't done a very good job, I don't think, of telling our story.
That letter you and the governors wrote to the president, have you heard from him back in any way?
We have not yet heard from the administration. We also wrote a letter here this week to the ambassador, to Ambassador Jacobson, just seeking clarification, because he did say there was no attempt to link, but this is the discussion happening, and we have asked him for some clarification as of just before the weekend began, as of Friday.
All right, I want to change the subject here now and talk a little bit about Senate reform with you as well, because your government, very early on in its mandate, passed a bill to provide Ottawa with a list of elected nominees. And you've been frustrated, I think it's fair to say, with how people keep getting appointed anyway. And in 2010, you said this: "Are we pushing a rope uphill here in Saskatchewan? Maybe the time has come for everyone to realize if the Senate can't be fixed, is it useful?" Very good question. What's your answer to it 3 years later?
Well, I don't think there is an answer. I can tell you that we went a step further. I indicated as leader of our party that that maybe we should change our own policy from elected senators to abolishing the Senate. Now, we went to our party. We have a democratic process for policy determination, and this fall the Saskatchewan party met and this resolution was put, and they did decide to continue with the policy of reforming the Senate through electing senators. So that's the official policy. Now, I think recent discussion has people talking. I think Senator Siegel, just before the weekend began, I think Friday or Thursday, was musing about a national referendum. What
do you think about that? Would that have your support?
I think it might be time for Canadians to weigh in on this particular issue. I would say that in the West, we've wanted a Triple E Senate. I'm wondering, frankly, whether or not we have it on a de facto basis because of the devolution of our federation, because of the strength that there exists in the provincial capitals. Are the provinces and the duly elected governments in those provinces actually providing that Triple E Senate, frankly, actually providing that check and balance against the House of Commons. That's not all the Senate was to be about. It was also to be about regional representation. But Kevin, the provinces are doing that as well. I think Canadians are ready for a discussion.
And it sounds like your position personally as Premier of Saskatchewan, that there's not much use for it anymore.
Well, I'm saying that the provincial governments I think, are providing the best elements of the Senate already at the provincial level, and those governments are elected, and those governments are obviously all accountable.
And from your point of view, would the abolition of the Senate require the consent of all the provinces to be legitimate, or do you think that's possible with fewer than unanimity?
You know, there's a pretty clear formula prescribed for constitutional change, and notwithstanding what might be possible, and I've heard that discussion outside of that process, I've heard this discussed before, I think if there's any major change like that, it should follow along with any amending formula that's already prescribed in our Constitution.
Well, one of the appointed senators from Saskatchewan is Pamela Wallin. She's being investigated, along with others, for expenses for her travels to Saskatchewan. Is she a presence in your province? Oh,
absolutely. Senator Wallin is a clear presence and a regular presence in Saskatchewan. I think I didn't know the numbers until all the questions had come out, but 168 days it was, I think, in the last fiscal year or calendar year, I'm not even sure, but Senator Wallin is in Saskatchewan, not just in and around her home of Wadena, but in the capital and in Saskatoon at various functions. So, you know, I don't know about the details of expenses. That needs to be resolved. But yes, she has a presence here for sure.
All right, Premier. Thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Have a good Sunday.